The cruelest betrayals are often the ones we invent before learning the truth. The Great Hall of Hawthorne Palace had never been quieter. Hundreds of nobles, military commanders, and honored guests stood beneath towering stone arches, while silver banners bearing the royal crest swayed gently in the evening breeze drifting through the open windows. What had begun as the annual moon blessing ceremony, a celebration meant to honor unity between every alpha, beta, and omega throughout the kingdom, had transformed into something no one expected. At the center of the marble floor stood Emily Carter, a young omega with pale white skin and calm gray eyes, her hands folded peacefully before her as whispers spread through the crowd like a gathering storm. She did not lower her head in shame, nor did she raise her voice in protest. She simply waited. Across from her, seated upon the elevated throne carved from ancient white oak, Alpha King Alexander Hayes watched the royal investigator finish reading the final accusation. According to the report, confidential information concerning the kingdom's northern defenses had been passed into unknown hands. A witness claimed to have seen Emily carrying sealed documents beyond the palace gates after sunset. Another claimed she had secretly met with strangers inside the forest. The evidence appeared complete. The testimonies seemed convincing. Even members of the royal council exchanged disappointed glances, unable to imagine that the quiet omega they barely noticed could have hidden such dangerous intentions. Alexander slowly rose to his feet. His commanding presence immediately silenced every lingering whisper. For years he had ruled with unwavering confidence, believing that justice required decisiveness above hesitation. Every difficult judgment he had made strengthened the kingdom. Every sacrifice seemed necessary. Looking directly into Emily's eyes, he searched for fear, anger, or desperation. Instead, he found only a sadness so gentle that it unsettled him in ways he could not explain. "Emily Carter," Alexander said firmly, his voice echoing throughout the great hall, "you stand accused of betraying this kingdom and placing innocent lives at risk. Before this court reaches its final judgment, you may speak." Every eye turned toward Emily. A single explanation could have changed everything. A desperate denial might have created doubt. Yet Emily remained silent for several long moments before finally lifting her gaze to meet Alexander's. "Your Majesty," she answered softly, "I have always prayed for your safety and for the peace of this kingdom." Her quiet response confused the gathering. It was not a defense. It was not a confession. It was simply the truth as she chose to leave it. The royal investigator frowned impatiently. "Do you deny the accusations?" Emily looked toward the stained glass windows where fading sunlight painted soft colors across the polished floor. "Some truths cannot be spoken before their proper time," she replied. Murmurs immediately swept through the hall. To many, her answer sounded like quiet acceptance. Alexander felt disappointment settle heavily upon his heart. He had trusted the investigation. He believed the evidence before him. A king could not allow uncertainty to weaken justice. Drawing a slow breath, he delivered the words that forever changed both their lives. "Emily Carter, from this day forward, you are stripped of your place within this palace. You are banished from Hawthorne Kingdom's royal court as a traitor." The sound of those words lingered in the silent chamber long after they were spoken. Emily closed her eyes for only a brief moment before offering a respectful bow. There were no tears, no anger, no plea for mercy. She quietly removed the silver pendant she had worn since entering palace service years before and placed it carefully upon the marble floor. Hidden beneath her traveling cloak rested a small leather pouch containing documents that could have cleared her name before every person in the room. Instead, she tightened her hand around it and walked toward the palace doors without another word. She chose exile over revealing a secret that would place Alexander in greater danger than he could possibly imagine. As the enormous doors slowly closed behind her, the ceremony officially ended, yet Alexander remained standing beside his throne, unable to explain the unfamiliar emptiness settling deep within his chest. For the first time since becoming Alpha King, victory did not feel like justice. It felt like the beginning of a mistake that neither power nor authority could somehow erase. The morning after Emily Carter disappeared beyond the palace gates, Hawthorne Kingdom awoke exactly as it always had. Merchants opened their shops before sunrise. Blacksmiths filled the streets with the familiar rhythm of hammers striking steel, and children hurried through village squares carrying baskets of fresh bread for their families. From the highest balcony of Hawthorne Palace, Alpha King Alexander Hayes watched the capital come alive beneath a clear spring sky, convincing himself that his difficult decision had preserved the kingdom's future. Justice often demanded painful choices, and he had spent years believing that a ruler who hesitated placed every innocent life at risk. Yet as another day unfolded, an unfamiliar silence seemed to settle inside the palace itself. Servants quietly completed their work, but small acts of thoughtfulness that once happened without notice slowly disappeared. Fresh flowers no longer appeared in the royal library before important meetings. Warm meals prepared for elderly palace guards quietly stopped arriving during late evening shifts. Blankets once delivered anonymously to injured soldiers recovering in the palace infirmary were suddenly missing. None of these changes seemed important by themselves, yet together they created an emptiness no one could immediately explain. Alexander noticed it without understanding why. He buried himself in royal duties, signing trade agreements, reviewing harvest reports, and listening to advisors discuss border security. But every evening the palace felt strangely colder than before. Beyond the capital, Emily traveled through winding forest roads until she reached a peaceful mountain valley where an elderly healer named Eleanor welcomed strangers without asking questions about the burdens they carried. Emily offered to work in exchange for a place to sleep, and Eleanor accepted with a gentle smile after seeing the kindness reflected in the young Omega's gray eyes. Within days, Emily became part of the quiet community. She gathered herbs before sunrise, prepared simple remedies for sick children, repaired torn clothing for elderly neighbors, and spent long afternoons helping families plant vegetables before the growing season ended. She never mentioned Hawthorne Palace. She never defended her own name. The small leather pouch remained carefully hidden beneath a loose wooden floorboard inside her modest room because she still believed revealing its contents too soon would place others in danger. Back inside the kingdom, unusual problems slowly began appearing in places Alexander rarely expected. A small village school postponed repairs because anonymous donations that had quietly supported struggling teachers had suddenly stopped arriving. A widow who relied upon mysterious deliveries of firewood found none waiting outside her home as colder nights returned to the mountains. An orphanage reduced its daily meals after an unknown benefactor simply vanished without explanation. People remembered receiving help for years, yet almost no one knew who had provided it. They only knew that the quiet generosity they once depended upon had disappeared. During a routine audience inside the palace, two village elders unexpectedly thanked Alexander for many years of unseen kindness they believed had come directly from the crown. Their gratitude puzzled him because he had never authorized most of the assistance they described. Curious, he asked who had delivered the supplies. The elderly men exchanged uncertain glances before one answered softly, "We never learned her name, Your Majesty. She always arrived alone, left everything behind, and asked us to thank no one." Alexander dismissed the meeting, but the conversation lingered in his thoughts long after the doors closed. That evening he wandered through the nearly silent palace corridors, passing the small reading room where Emily had often organized forgotten books for young servants during quiet afternoons. The room remained perfectly clean, yet something about its stillness felt unfamiliar. He paused for only a moment before continuing toward his private chambers, quietly reminding himself that a king could not allow emotion to cloud judgment. Even so, as darkness settled across Hawthorne Kingdom and thousands of stars appeared above the palace towers, Alexander found himself asking a question that had never crossed his mind before. If Emily truly had been a traitor, why did her absence leave behind so many quiet acts of goodness that no one else had ever seemed to notice until she was gone? Nearly 3 weeks passed before Alpha King Alexander Hayes finally gave in to the quiet question that refused to leave his thoughts. Every report crossing his desk confirmed that Hawthorne Kingdom remained peaceful, yet the unexplained absence of countless anonymous acts of kindness continued to trouble him far more than border disputes or trade negotiations. One cool spring morning, he left the palace accompanied by only 2 trusted guards, telling the royal council that he wished to inspect villages preparing for the upcoming harvest. In truth, he hoped to discover who had been quietly supporting so many ordinary lives for so many years. His journey first led him to a small farming community where children ran freely between rows of newly planted vegetables. While speaking with local families about crop conditions, Alexander noticed an elderly farmer carefully repairing a wooden bridge that looked far newer than the surrounding structures. Curious, he asked who had paid for the lumber. The farmer smiled gently before answering. A young Omega convinced traveling merchants to donate everything we needed several years ago. She said every child deserved a safe way to cross the river before school. Alexander asked her name. The old man shook his head. She never stayed long enough for us to ask. She only wore a small silver pendant with a wildflower carved into it. Alexander felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. Emily had worn that very pendant every day inside Hawthorne Palace until the morning she quietly placed it upon the marble floor before leaving forever. The coincidence lingered in his thoughts as the journey continued. In another village, the local teacher proudly showed Alexander a small classroom, filled with books that had allowed dozens of children to learn how to read. Someone delivered these every winter, she explained with a grateful smile. She said knowledge should never belong only to the wealthy. Again, no official records existed. Again, no reward had ever been accepted. Again, the description matched Emily. The further Alexander traveled, the more familiar every story became. A physician remembered receiving rare medicinal herbs during a dangerous outbreak that saved dozens of patients. A widow quietly spoke about mysterious deliveries of blankets after her husband passed away. A retired soldier recalled finding food outside his cottage every week while recovering from injuries that prevented him from working. None of these people had ever met one another. Yet every memory pointed toward the same quiet Omega who appeared only long enough to help before disappearing without expecting gratitude. Late that afternoon, Alexander reached a peaceful village chapel surrounded by blooming white flowers. The elderly pastor welcomed him warmly and proudly displayed a handmade quilt used each winter to keep orphan children warm during cold mountain nights. As Alexander admired the careful stitching, his attention stopped on one small corner embroidered with a delicate silver wildflower. He immediately recognized the design. Years earlier, Emily had patiently repaired one of his traveling cloaks after it had torn during a hunting expedition. She had quietly added the exact same silver wildflower inside the collar where almost no one would ever notice it. His fingers brushed lightly across the familiar embroidery as forgotten memories surfaced with startling clarity. Emily organizing supplies after royal celebrations long after everyone else had gone home. Emily slipping extra food into baskets prepared for struggling families. Emily smiling softly whenever someone else received credit for work she had quietly completed herself. The stories he had collected throughout the kingdom no longer felt like separate acts of kindness. They formed one continuous pattern stretching across years of silent service. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the distant hills, Alexander stepped outside the chapel and looked across the peaceful valley glowing beneath the golden evening light. For the first time since Emily's exile, he allowed himself to consider the possibility he had spent weeks resisting. Perhaps the greatest strength holding Hawthorne Kingdom together had never belonged to its throne. Perhaps it had always belonged to the quiet Omega whose name he had erased with a single judgment, never realizing that every forgotten miracle the kingdom cherished had begun with her. Alexander Hayes returned to Hawthorne Palace, carrying far more than memories from the villages he had visited. Every conversation echoed inside his mind, refusing to disappear beneath the endless responsibilities waiting upon his desk. The smiling teacher, the grateful farmer, the retired soldier, and the elderly pastor had never met one another, yet every path somehow led back to Emily Carter. Their stories did not sound rehearsed or exaggerated. They were quiet memories shared without expectation, making them impossible to dismiss as coincidence. For the first time since ascending the throne, Alexander questioned not only the judgment he had delivered, but also the investigation that had persuaded him to believe it. Before sunrise the following morning, he walked alone toward the oldest wing of the royal archives, a place few people visited unless searching for forgotten records or ancient treaties. Dust-covered shelves stretching from floor to ceiling while narrow windows allowed only thin rays of morning light to reach the weathered wooden tables below. The chief archivist, an elderly man who had served 3 generations of the royal family, greeted Alexander with visible surprise before immediately unlocking the secure chamber containing documents related to matters of national security. Alexander requested every report connected to Emily's trial, the northern border investigation, and Commander Elias Rowan's final assignments. Hours passed as page after page covered the large oak table. At first, everything appeared exactly as he remembered. Witness statements, investigation summaries, official seals, and signed recommendations all supported the decision that had exiled Emily from the palace. Yet the more carefully Alexander compared dates, signatures, and references, the more small inconsistencies emerged. Several reports referred to evidence that no longer existed inside the archive. A witness statement mentioned an attached map that had vanished. Another document cited an intelligence report carrying a registration number belonging to an entirely different investigation. None of these discoveries alone proved deception, but together they suggested that something important had disappeared before the trial ever began. The elderly archivist quietly studied the files beside Alexander before suddenly pausing with a troubled expression. He excused himself and disappeared into a storage room rarely opened except during annual inventory. Several minutes later, he returned carrying a weathered leather ledger covered with dust. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "this should have been catalogued with Commander Rowan's personal records after his passing several months ago. Somehow it was placed among retired supply inventories instead." Alexander accepted the ledger and slowly opened the worn cover. Inside were handwritten notes documenting evidence transfers, confidential meetings, and sealed correspondence connected to Rowan's final investigation. Near the last completed page rested a folded envelope bearing the commander's unmistakable handwriting together with the royal seal. Across the front, only a single sentence appeared: "To be delivered directly to His Majesty if I cannot finish what I began." Alexander carefully broke the faded wax seal and unfolded the letter with steady hands. The first lines immediately stole the air from his lungs. Rowan explained that the investigation surrounding the northern border remained incomplete because powerful individuals had manipulated information before every responsible party could be identified. He warned that any judgment made before the operation concluded risked condemning an innocent person whose role inside the investigation had to remain hidden until every piece of evidence could safely be revealed. The letter ended abruptly in the middle of a sentence, as though Rowan had been called away before finishing his final thoughts. Alexander lowered the unfinished page and stared silently across the archive. Emily's trial had not been built upon complete truth. Someone had allowed a broken investigation to become a final judgment, and for the first time since the day she quietly walked away from the palace, Alexander realized that the greatest mistake of his reign might not have been trusting the wrong person, but failing to discover how much of the truth had been deliberately kept from the throne. The unanswered questions left behind by Commander Elias Rowan's unfinished letter refused to give Alpha King Alexander Hayes even a single peaceful night. Every missing record pointed toward a truth that someone had carefully buried long before Emily Carter stood alone inside the Great Hall to face his judgment. Instead of allowing the investigation to end with suspicion, Alexander decided to follow the only path still open before him. If the official records had been altered, then the people whose lives Emily had quietly changed might reveal the pieces that written documents could not. Carrying Rowan's weathered ledger inside a small leather satchel, Alexander left Hawthorne Palace once again with only 2 trusted guards and traveled farther than he had during his previous journey. This time he no longer searched for evidence of guilt. He searched for the woman hidden behind years of silent sacrifice. In the first village he visited, an elderly physician welcomed him into a modest clinic lined with shelves of dried herbs and carefully labeled glass jars. When Alexander asked whether she remembered a young Omega with gray eyes, the physician smiled warmly before reaching into an old cabinet and removing a faded notebook. Between its worn pages rested dozens of carefully folded receipts documenting expensive medicines that had somehow been paid in full by an anonymous donor. Whenever families could not afford treatment, the physician explained softly, she quietly covered the cost before anyone realized there was a problem. She always asked me to tell the patients that hope had found them, never that she had. Alexander carefully examined the receipts. None carried Emily's name, yet every payment had been made on the exact dates she had requested permission to leave the palace for charitable visits. As his journey continued, another village welcomed him with similar memories. A blacksmith proudly showed him sturdy farming tools purchased years earlier by an unnamed young woman after floods destroyed several family workshops. A schoolmaster opened a wooden chest containing maps, books, and writing supplies that had allowed children from poor families to continue their education. A widow quietly unfolded letters proving that someone had secretly paid the taxes on her small home after her husband passed away, allowing her to remain where generations of her family had lived. Alexander listened without interruption, recording every account inside his notebook. Some people remembered Emily immediately. Others paused before suddenly recognizing her gentle smile from years earlier. Although their stories differed, they all described the same remarkable pattern. Emily never waited to be asked for help. She simply noticed suffering before anyone else did and quietly carried part of another person's burden without asking for gratitude in return. Late that afternoon, Alexander arrived at a small orphanage standing beside a peaceful lake. The elderly caretaker welcomed him inside and proudly showed a bright dining room filled with children laughing together over a warm evening meal. Hanging upon one wall was a simple wooden plaque carved with the words, "Kindness grows strongest when no one is watching." The caretaker smiled gently after noticing Alexander reading it. "Those words came from the young Omega who visited every season," she explained. "Whenever we thanked her, she would only say that the strongest hearts never need applause." Something inside Alexander quietly broke. He remembered Emily speaking almost those exact words years earlier after organizing supplies for families affected by a harsh winter. At the time, he had barely noticed. Now, every forgotten conversation returned with painful clarity. As sunset painted the lake with golden light, Alexander closed his notebook and looked across the peaceful water. The evidence he carried no longer consisted only of documents and missing records. It lived inside healed lives, educated children, restored homes, grateful families, and hopeful communities scattered throughout the kingdom. Piece by piece, he finally understood what no investigation had ever recorded. Emily had never simply served Hawthorne Kingdom. She had quietly become one of the invisible foundations holding it together, and the deeper Alexander searched for the truth, the more impossible it became to believe that a woman who had given so much to everyone else could ever have betrayed the one person she had sacrificed everything to protect. Several days after returning to Hawthorne Palace, Alpha King Alexander Hayes found himself unable to concentrate on matters that had once demanded every moment of his attention. Trade agreements remained unsigned upon his desk. Royal advisors patiently waited for decisions concerning harvest routes and border patrols. Yet Alexander's thoughts continually returned to Commander Elias Rowan's unfinished letter and the countless lives Emily Carter had quietly changed without ever asking for recognition. Every new discovery strengthened the same impossible conclusion. Nothing about the woman he believed he had judged resembled the person described by the people of Hawthorne Kingdom. Determined to uncover every remaining piece of the truth, Alexander ordered the royal archives searched once more, this time including every personal belonging recovered after Commander Rowan passed away from a sudden illness several weeks after the Northern investigation officially ended. By late afternoon, an elderly palace steward arrived carrying a weathered wooden chest that had remained sealed since Rowan's funeral. Inside rested neatly folded maps, coded reports, several wax-sealed envelopes that had already been opened during routine military review, and one small leather journal hidden beneath a false wooden panel. The steward admitted that no one had ever noticed the concealed compartment before. Alexander carefully lifted the journal into his hands. The worn cover carried no title, only Rowan's personal crest pressed into faded brown leather. As he opened the first page, familiar handwriting immediately confirmed that these were the commander's private observations rather than official military records. Each entry described the secret investigation into false intelligence deliberately spreading through the kingdom, while trusted officers quietly searched for those responsible. Several pages later, Alexander reached an entry that caused him to stop breathing for a moment. Rowan described Emily not as a suspect, but as one of the few people he trusted completely. Because palace servants and gentle omegas attracted little attention from conspirators, Emily had volunteered to carry harmless-looking correspondence that secretly connected loyal investigators working in different parts of the kingdom. She accepted the responsibility, knowing that discovery would place suspicion directly upon her. Alexander slowly continued reading. Another entry revealed that only days before the royal ceremony, Rowan had uncovered evidence proving that the hidden conspiracy had not yet been completely exposed. If Emily publicly explained her true role before every remaining conspirator had been identified, the entire operation would collapse, innocent witnesses would disappear, and the Alpha King himself would become the easiest target for those still working in secret. The final completed page contained words Alexander knew he would remember for the rest of his life. Lady Emily understands the danger more clearly than anyone. She insists that if choosing between her own honor and His Majesty's safety ever becomes necessary, she has already made her decision. She would rather allow history to condemn her than allow the king to face unseen danger before this mission reaches its proper conclusion. Alexander closed the journal, unable to look away from Rowan's final signature. Emily had never remained silent because she lacked proof of her innocence. She had remained silent because revealing the truth during her trial would have destroyed the investigation protecting both the kingdom and the man she had quietly chosen to place before herself. At that very moment, far beyond the palace walls, Emily finished gathering fresh herbs beside a gentle mountain stream before returning to Eleanor's small cottage. After preparing medicine for an elderly neighbor recovering from a lingering illness, she quietly removed the familiar leather pouch from beneath the loose floorboard where it had remained untouched since the day of her exile. She held it carefully for a long moment before placing it back exactly where it belonged. The danger had passed, but she still believed that preserving peace mattered more than reclaiming her own reputation. As evening settled over Hawthorne Palace, Alexander stood alone beside the window overlooking the sleeping capital. The crown resting upon his head suddenly felt lighter than the weight carried inside his heart. The woman he had called a traitor had never betrayed him for a single moment. Instead, she had willingly surrendered her home, her honor, and every dream she once carried so that the Alpha King could continue living beneath a sky she quietly protected without ever expecting him to learn the truth. Before sunrise the following morning, Alpha King Alexander Hayes quietly left Hawthorne Palace with only 2 trusted guards riding several yards behind him. He wore a simple traveling cloak instead of ceremonial robes, leaving behind every symbol of royal authority except the responsibility he could never remove from his heart. The weather journal of Commander Elias Rowan rested securely inside his saddlebag together with the unfinished letter that had changed everything. Neither document could erase the pain his judgment had caused, but they gave him something he should have sought from the beginning: the complete truth. Guided by directions gathered from grateful villagers during his recent journeys, Alexander followed narrow mountain roads until the towering forest slowly opened into a peaceful valley surrounded by wildflowers and gentle streams. The quiet settlement appeared untouched by palace politics. Children laughed while carrying baskets filled with fresh herbs. Elderly neighbors shared warm bread outside small cottages. Every face reflected a simple contentment that reminded Alexander how different life could be when kindness guided each ordinary day. As he approached the largest garden near the center of the valley, he saw Emily Carter kneeling beside a row of young flowering plants, patiently showing a little girl how to loosen the soil around fragile roots without harming them. The child listened carefully before smiling with pride as Emily praised her gentle hands. For several long moments Alexander remained completely still. Months earlier he believed exile would break the quiet Omega standing before him. Instead, she had created another home filled with peace, purpose, and compassion. Emily eventually sensed someone watching and slowly turned toward the garden entrance. Surprise briefly crossed her gray eyes when she recognized Alexander, but it quickly softened into calm acceptance. She thanked the child for helping before sending her to deliver herbs to Eleanor's cottage. When they finally stood facing one another, the silence between them carried the weight of everything that had never been spoken inside the palace. Alexander lowered his head first. It was not the respectful nod of a ruler greeting a subject. It was the humble acknowledgement of a man standing before the person he had wronged most deeply. "Emily," he said quietly, "I finally know why you never defended yourself." She looked at him gently without anger or triumph. "Then you know the kingdom remained safe." Her first concern was still the people she had protected rather than the injustice she had endured. Alexander slowly removed Rowan's journal and placed it carefully upon a nearby wooden table. "I know about the investigation. I know about the messages you carried. I know you chose silence because speaking would have placed my life and countless innocent lives in danger." Emily lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. Commander Rowan believed the truth would arrive when it could no longer harm anyone. "I trusted his judgment." Alexander struggled to steady his voice. "And I never trusted yours." The words hung quietly between them. "I believed incomplete evidence. I believed accusations. I believed certainty was stronger than patience. And because of that, I condemned the one person who had been protecting me all along." Emily listened without interruption. There was sadness in her expression, but no bitterness. "You carried the weight of a kingdom," she answered softly. "I carried a choice that I made willingly. Neither of us understood the whole picture." Alexander slowly shook his head. "You lost your home, your honor, and every future you deserved because I failed to ask one more question before passing judgment. I cannot return what I took from you. I cannot ask you to forget. But I could not continue calling myself a just king without standing here to tell you that I was wrong." A gentle breeze carried the fragrance of blooming flowers through the garden as sunlight warmed the quiet valley. Emily looked toward the distant mountains before turning back to Alexander with the same peaceful strength that had carried her through every hardship. "The past cannot be changed," she said gently, "but truth can still change the people who accept it." In that quiet moment, Alexander realized that forgiveness was never something a king could command. It was a gift offered only by a heart strong enough to choose compassion after enduring the deepest misunderstanding. And standing before Emily, he understood that the greatest lesson of his life had never been hidden inside royal laws or ancient traditions, but within the quiet courage of the Omega he had never truly seen until he had nearly lost her forever. 1 week after returning from the mountain valley, Alpha King Alexander Hayes issued a royal summons unlike any in the history of Hawthorne Kingdom. Messengers traveled across the realm inviting village elders, military commanders, teachers, physicians, merchants, craftsmen, and representatives from every region to gather inside the great courtyard of Hawthorne Palace. Rumors spread quickly through the kingdom. Some believed the king had uncovered a dangerous conspiracy. Others expected new laws concerning the northern border. No one imagined that the gathering had been called for a far more personal reason. On the morning of the assembly, thousands of citizens filled the palace grounds beneath a bright blue sky. The same marble platform where Emily Carter had once been condemned stood at the center of the courtyard, untouched since the day her life had changed forever. Emily arrived quietly beside Eleanor, wearing a simple blue dress without jewels or symbols of rank. She had accepted Alexander's invitation only after he promised that the purpose of the gathering was not to honor her, but to restore the truth. As she stepped into the courtyard, many people recognized the gentle Omega from stories passed between villages, yet few realized she was the same woman once accused before the entire kingdom. When the royal bells finally became silent, Alexander walked onto the platform carrying Commander Elias Rowan's journal, the unfinished letter, and the recovered archive records. He stood before his people without the distance that usually separated a king from those he ruled. Looking across the countless faces gathered before him, he drew a steady breath before speaking. "Months ago, I believed I was protecting this kingdom by acting quickly. I trusted incomplete evidence instead of pursuing complete truth. In doing so, I condemned an innocent woman whose loyalty exceeded my own understanding." A quiet stillness settled across the courtyard. Alexander carefully explained the hidden investigation, the missing records discovered inside the royal archives, and Rowan's final journal revealing Emily's secret role in protecting the kingdom. Every document was presented before respected council members, military officers, and village elders so that no part of the truth depended upon the king's words alone. Witnesses stepped forward one after another. The chief archivist confirmed the missing files. Former officers described Rowan's unfinished mission. Villagers shared memories of the anonymous kindness that had quietly sustained their communities for years. Piece by piece, the false story that had once defined Emily disappeared beneath undeniable truth. Alexander then turned toward Emily with visible humility. "Emily Carter," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard. "Before this kingdom and before every person who trusted my judgment, I confess that I failed you. I called you a traitor when you were protecting my life. I believed suspicion instead of your character. The dishonor belongs to my decision, not to your name." For several moments, no one moved. Then an elderly physician slowly stepped forward and bowed respectfully toward Emily. A village teacher followed. A retired soldier lowered his head. Families whose lives she had quietly changed over many years did the same until hundreds of people stood together in silent gratitude. Emily looked across the crowd with calm gray eyes filled not with pride, but with compassion. She stepped beside Alexander and spoke softly enough that the entire courtyard listened even more carefully. Justice becomes strongest when it has the patience to hear every truth. Kindness should never be mistaken for weakness, and silence should never be accepted as proof of guilt. Her words settled deeply into every heart present. Alexander immediately announced new royal laws requiring independent review of evidence, complete investigations before public judgment, and permanent safeguards protecting every alpha, beta, and omega from condemnation without undeniable proof. The people welcomed the reforms because they understood they had been born from humility instead of power. As warm afternoon sunlight covered Hawthorne Palace, Hawthorne Kingdom witnessed far more than the restoration of one innocent woman's reputation. It witnessed a king choosing accountability over pride, a kingdom embracing truth over assumption, and a future where justice would forever remember the quiet Omega whose courage changed not only one man's heart, but the conscience of an entire realm. Summer slowly gave way to autumn, and for the first time in many years the changing seasons brought not only beautiful colors to Hawthorne Kingdom, but also a quiet sense of trust that reached from the palace walls to the most distant mountain villages. The reforms announced by Alpha King Alexander Hayes soon became part of everyday life. Every important investigation now required complete evidence before judgment could ever be passed, and every citizen, whether Alpha, Beta, or Omega, stood equally protected beneath the law. When members of the royal council praised Alexander for creating a wiser kingdom, he always answered with the same humble words. "The greatest lesson I have ever learned came from the person I failed to trust." Emily Carter accepted none of the grand rewards repeatedly offered in recognition of her sacrifice. She politely declined expensive jewels, noble titles, and elaborate ceremonies, asking instead that every resource be used to expand schools, improve village clinics, repair roads connecting isolated communities, and provide warm homes for children without families. No one found her request surprising. It reflected the same quiet heart that had guided her long before anyone knew the truth. Emily divided her days between Hawthorne Palace and the peaceful mountain valley where Eleanor had welcomed her without questions during the darkest chapter of her life. Whenever she returned to the valley, the children still ran toward her with joyful laughter. The elderly neighbors still greeted her with warm smiles, and the gardens she had helped plant continued blooming beside the small cottages. Nothing about her kindness had changed because recognition had never been the reason she served others. Alexander visited the valley often, never arriving with unnecessary displays of royal power. Sometimes he joined local families planting young fruit trees whose harvest would feed future generations. Other days he quietly listened while farmers described their hopes for the coming seasons or helped carry supplies to elderly neighbors before returning to the palace before nightfall. Through those simple visits, he discovered that true leadership did not grow stronger through fear or unquestioned authority. It grew stronger through listening, humility, and the willingness to place the needs of others before personal pride. As the months passed, the friendship that slowly grew between Alexander and Emily became rooted in honesty rather than misunderstanding. They no longer spoke about the painful trial that had separated them except when remembering its lessons could help someone else avoid the same mistake. Instead, they shared plans for improving the kingdom, protecting future generations, and building a society where compassion stood beside justice instead of waiting behind it. The trust that had once been broken returned little by little, strengthened not by promises, but by countless ordinary days filled with consistent actions. One peaceful evening near the end of autumn, the people of Hawthorne Kingdom gathered inside the palace gardens to celebrate another successful harvest. Lanterns glowed softly beneath ancient oak trees while music drifted across the cool evening air. Children played beside flower gardens, families shared generous meals together, and laughter echoed through the same palace that had once witnessed heartbreaking silence. Standing beneath the clear night sky, Alexander gently reached for Emily's hand. This time there was no uncertainty between them, no hidden sacrifice waiting to be discovered, and no fear that truth would arrive too late. Emily smiled warmly as she accepted his hand, knowing that forgiveness had never erased the past, but had transformed it into the strongest foundation they could ever build together. Looking across the joyful kingdom surrounding them, Alexander finally understood that a crown alone could never make someone worthy of leading others. Only humility, compassion, and the courage to admit painful mistakes could accomplish that. Long after their own lives became cherished history, parents continued sharing their story with children throughout Hawthorne Kingdom, reminding every new generation that the strongest hearts are not those who never fail, but those who find the courage to seek the truth, accept responsibility, offer forgiveness, and choose love over judgment every single time. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts, like, share, subscribe, enable notifications, and join us for more unforgettable alpha romance stories ahead.